The moment the judge said her name was no longer attached to anything, Alicia Bennett realized silence could hurt louder than words ever could. The courtroom in downtown Chicago felt colder than the winter wind outside, even though the heating vents hummed softly above the polished wooden benches. Hassan Walker stood a few feet away, composed in a way that no longer felt familiar to her, his expression steady as if he had rehearsed every second of this moment in advance. The final ruling echoed through the room with procedural precision. The house on Lakeview Drive, the family car, and custody arrangements for the children would all remain under his control. No raised voices followed the decision, no dramatic interruption, only the sound of legal finality settling into the space between them. Alicia did not speak when people expected her to, did not react when the clerk began organizing papers that effectively redrew her life into something smaller than it had been the day before. Around here, people shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others watching with quiet curiosity as if witnessing a conclusion rather than a collapse. Jason adjusted his cufflinks slightly, a subtle gesture that suggested comfort rather than conflict, while Alicia stood still, holding on to a reality that no longer recognized her as its center. Years earlier, she had helped build the foundation of everything now being divided in that room, long nights spent balancing finances, supporting early business risks, and carrying responsibilities that rarely made it into official records or public acknowledgement. But none of that appeared in the language of the court, only numbers, signatures, and assigned outcomes that reduced years into a few printed pages. When the hearing ended, the judge offered a final procedural acknowledgement, and the room slowly began to empty, chairs scraping softly against the floor as conversations resumed in lower tones. Hassan walked out first, his steps measured, followed by his legal team, leaving behind a wake of controlled certainty. Alicia remained seated for a few seconds longer, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if confirming to herself that the moment had actually ended and was not still unfolding somewhere beneath reality. When she finally stood, she carried nothing except a small personal bag and a settlement amount that barely reached $300, transferred and confirmed without ceremony. The hallway outside the courtroom was brighter than she remembered, fluorescent lights reflecting off white walls that felt too clean for what had just happened inside. People moved past her without noticing, absorbed in their own directions, their own lives continuing without interruption. Alicia walked forward slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because there was nowhere else to rush toward. Being here, the door to the courtroom closed with a quiet finality that did not echo, and in that absence of sound, something in her life ended without needing to announce itself. She stepped outside into the city air, where traffic continued flowing and strangers passed by without knowing that a life had just been rewritten in silence, and for the first time, she understood that being left with almost nothing could still mean being left with the beginning of something entirely new. The city outside the courthouse did not slow down for her, cars continued moving through downtown Chicago in steady streams, horns blending into the distant hum of everyday life, while Alicia Bennett stood on the sidewalk holding a small paper receipt that confirmed what the courtroom had already decided. $300 was now the remaining structure of her financial world, reduced and precise, transferred into an account that felt more like a boundary than a beginning. She walked without direction at first, passing storefronts she once knew from a different version of her life, places where she had stopped for coffee during earlier years when everything still felt shared and expandable. Now each step felt quieter, not because the city had changed, but because she had. By the time evening arrived, she found herself in a small rented room on the edge of a neighborhood where the buildings were older, the paint slightly faded, and the light from street lamps carried a softer, more distant tone. There was no celebration of arrival, only the acknowledgement that this was where continuity resumed. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a small table, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot where cars came and went without memory. That night she did not sleep easily, not because of sadness in the dramatic sense, but because her mind kept returning to the silence of the courtroom, the way decisions had been made about her life without needing her voice to participate. Days passed in a rhythm that had no ceremony. Alicia found work wherever it was available, first in a small diner that operated 24 hours a day, where the smell of coffee and grilled food became part of her clothing and skin. She worked early mornings and late nights, wiping counters, preparing simple meals, learning the timing of a kitchen that never fully stopped moving. No one there knew her past, and she did not offer it. That anonymity became its own kind of structure, not painful, but unfamiliar. There were moments when exhaustion settled into her shoulders, but she kept moving, because stopping felt heavier than continuing. One afternoon, while serving a group of customers near the window, she overheard a casual comment from a delivery driver about how some of the most popular food in the area came from small independent trucks that started with almost nothing. The words were not directed at her, but they remained with her long after the conversation ended. That evening, after her shift ended and the streets outside had begun to empty, she stood outside the diner holding her small earnings for the day, watching the quiet flow of traffic under the orange glow of streetlights. The idea did not arrive like inspiration in a sudden moment, but rather as a slow recognition of possibility. She thought about mobility, about reaching people directly, about food as something that could travel instead of waiting to be discovered. The next day, she began asking questions in between shifts, researching used vehicles, comparing prices, learning what could be purchased with limited funds. Every answer reinforced the same limitation, but also a narrow opening. Eventually she found it, a second-hand food truck listed for exactly $300, damaged in appearance but still functional in structure. It was not presented as something promising, only as something available. When she arrived to see it, the metal exterior showed signs of long use, the paint faded and uneven, the interior stripped down to basic surfaces that required rebuilding. The seller spoke without expectation, more interested in clearing space than in selling a dream. Alicia listened carefully, not to persuasion, but to condition. After a short silence, she agreed. The transaction was completed quickly, with paperwork signed on a clipboard under the open sky, the sound of passing cars filling the pauses between signatures. When she took the keys, they felt lighter than expected, almost ordinary, as if they belonged to something unfinished rather than something established. That night she sat inside the empty food truck parked near her rented room, looking through the open service window at the street beyond. There was no announcement of transformation, no moment of arrival, only the quiet understanding that something had shifted from survival into construction. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, she did not feel like she was moving away from something, but toward something that had not yet taken shape. The first light of morning reached the edge of the parking lot where the food truck stood, casting a pale reflection across its worn metal surface, and Alicia Bennett sat inside quietly as if listening to the structure of a new life forming through silence rather than instruction. The interior was still empty, stripped down to its essential frame, with only a folding chair and a small portable stove she had borrowed from a second-hand shop a few blocks away. The air carried the faint scent of metal and dust mixed with yesterday's uncertainty, but she did not treat it as a limitation, only as the beginning condition of something unfinished. That morning she started with cleaning, wiping every corner of the truck with a damp cloth until her hands moved with rhythm instead of hesitation, as if repetition itself could replace stability. There was no audience, no expectation, only the steady sound of passing vehicles on the street nearby and the distant hum of a city already moving on without her. By midday she had written a simple menu on a piece of paper, nothing elaborate, only basic meals that could be prepared quickly with limited equipment, the kind of food that depended more on care than complexity. She placed the paper near the service window and stood back for a moment, studying it as if it belonged to someone else. The first customer arrived later that afternoon, a man in work clothes carrying the fatigue of construction labor, who paused in front of the truck more out of curiosity than intention. He ordered without conversation, handed over a few folded bills, and waited while she prepared the meal with careful attention to timing and heat. When she passed the food through the window, there was no ceremony, only a quiet exchange that lasted a few seconds, yet when he took the first bite, his expression changed in a way that required no explanation. Word did not spread quickly at first, only in small increments, through conversations between people who worked in nearby streets, delivery drivers, and passers-by who began to notice that the same truck appeared in the same location each day with increasing consistency. Alicia remained consistent with her routine, arriving early, preparing ingredients with precision, learning how to manage heat distribution on equipment that was not designed for efficiency. There were days when sales were minimal, when she returned home with only enough money to cover basic expenses, but she did not interpret those days as failure. Instead, she treated them as data, adjustments in timing, location, and preparation that required refinement rather than reaction. Over time, small improvements accumulated without announcement. A customer returned twice in 1 week, then brought another person the following day. A short video recorded by someone nearby captured her working quietly inside the truck, focused and composed, the image circulating through social platforms without her awareness. There was no dramatic caption, only curiosity about how a single food truck in a modest neighborhood could draw attention without advertising. Alicia did not engage with the online attention when it reached her indirectly through a customer mentioning it. She simply continued working, adjusting ingredients, improving consistency, learning how each small detail influenced the experience of those who came. One evening, after closing the truck, she counted her earnings in silence under the dim light of a nearby street lamp, noticing that the numbers had slowly grown beyond what she had started with, not dramatically, but steadily enough to suggest direction. She did not celebrate, because there was no clear point of arrival yet, only continuation. The city around her remained indifferent, but within that indifference she was building something that did not require permission to exist. And for the first time since the courtroom, her days were no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what she was quietly assembling with her own hands. The morning air carried a different weight now, not of uncertainty but of repetition becoming structure, as Alicia Bennett arrived at the food truck before sunrise, unlocking the metal door with the same quiet motion she had repeated every day since it first began to move from an idea into a routine. The street outside was still half awake, with delivery vans passing slowly and a few early pedestrians wrapped in jackets against the cool air, but inside the truck she had already entered a rhythm that no longer felt new. She checked the small propane stove, adjusted the limited storage containers, and reviewed the handwritten menu that had slowly evolved over days of small adjustments rather than dramatic changes. Each action was precise, not rushed, as if she were learning a language spoken through repetition instead of instruction. By the time the sun rose higher, she had already prepared the first batch of ingredients, and the scent of simple cooking began to drift faintly through the open service window. At first, customers came sporadically, one or two at a time, often stopping out of curiosity more than intention, but she treated each interaction the same, with quiet attention and consistency. There was no marketing, no announcement. Only presence, and over time that presence began to accumulate weight. A construction worker who had visited once returned again 3 days later, then brought a co-worker with him the next time, mentioning without ceremony that the food felt reliable in a way that was difficult to explain. Alicia listened without responding much, her focus always on preparation and timing, as if speaking less allowed the work itself to become clearer. In the afternoons, when the pace slowed, she used the quiet moments to refine small details, adjusting seasoning, rethinking preparation order, observing how heat affected texture in ways that could not be predicted but only learned through experience. The truck itself began to feel less like a temporary solution and more like a controlled environment, a small system she could understand completely because she had built it through direct involvement rather than delegation. One afternoon, a delivery driver who often passed through the area mentioned casually that someone had recorded a short video of the truck and posted it online, not as promotion but as observation. Alicia paused for only a moment when she heard it, then continued working, not asking for details, not seeking context, as if external attention was something separate from the process she was committed to building. That evening, however, she noticed a slight change in the flow of customers, not a sudden surge but a steady increase in unfamiliar faces who mentioned seeing something online without needing to explain further. The line at the truck grew longer than usual, and for the first time she had to manage timing not only for preparation but for consistency under pressure. She did not rush, instead maintaining the same pace, allowing the process to absorb the change without breaking its structure. Later that night, after closing, she counted the day's earnings inside the dim light of the truck, noticing that the total was higher than any previous day, not dramatically, but enough to mark a shift in pattern. She did not smile, did not react outwardly, only recorded the number mentally as part of an ongoing adjustment. Outside, the neighborhood remained unchanged, but within her routine something had begun to expand quietly, not as an event but as a consequence of repetition sustained long enough to become visible. The morning began earlier than usual, with a thin layer of gray light spreading across the street before sunrise, and Alicia Bennett was already inside the food truck, moving through her preparation routine with a quiet consistency that no longer felt unfamiliar. The sound of metal utensils meeting stainless steel surfaces created a soft rhythm that replaced any need for external structure, as if the space itself had begun to remember her movements. She checked inventory with careful attention, not because there was abundance to manage, but because precision had become the only form of control available to her. Outside, the city slowly activated, one block at a time, delivery vehicles passing with headlights still on, pedestrians moving with coffee in hand, and the distant hum of traffic building into a steady background presence. By the time the first hour of operation began, she had already prepared everything needed for the day, positioning herself at the service window with a calm focus that had become her default state. Customers arrived in a pattern that no longer felt random. There were familiar faces from nearby workplaces, construction workers, office employees on break, and delivery drivers who now recognized the truck as part of their daily route. Orders were placed without hesitation, and Alicia responded with efficiency, maintaining the same measured pace regardless of how long the line became. The consistency of her work began to create a rhythm that others adapted to, rather than the other way around. Conversations among customers started to shift subtly, from simple remarks about food quality to questions about how long the truck had been operating and who was behind it. Alicia never volunteered personal details, responding only with brief, neutral answers before returning to preparation. That distance, however, did not reduce interest, instead, it increased it. People began to return not only for the food but for the presence of something that felt steady in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Later in the week, a short video clip surfaced online again, this time showing her working during a busy afternoon, captured from across the street without her knowledge. It spread through small local communities first, then expanded beyond the neighborhood, reaching viewers who were drawn not by marketing but by authenticity. Comments and shares began to accumulate, but Alicia remained unaware for most of it, continuing her routine without interruption. When a regular customer mentioned that people were asking online about the truck, she simply nodded and continued cooking, treating the information as something external to her immediate responsibility. However, the effect became increasingly visible in the physical world. Lines formed earlier each day, sometimes stretching farther down the block, requiring her to adjust preparation timing and manage supply more carefully. She did not interpret this as success or failure, only as change requiring adaptation. One afternoon, while briefly resting between orders, she observed the flow of people outside the truck window, noticing how expectations had shifted without formal acknowledgement. People now waited with anticipation rather than curiosity, and that difference subtly changed the atmosphere around her work. Despite the growing attention, she maintained the same internal discipline, refusing to expand beyond what she could personally control. Every decision remained grounded in direct observation rather than external pressure. By the end of the week, her earnings had increased again, not through sudden change but through steady accumulation, confirming a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet even as the environment around her evolved, Alicia remained focused on the only structure she trusted, the repetition of work, the clarity of execution, and the quiet understanding that recognition, when it came, would not define her direction, only confirm it. The day began earlier than the sun fully rising, with a faint blue tint spreading across the horizon as Alicia Bennett unlocked the food truck and stepped inside with the same quiet discipline that had defined her recent weeks. The city around her was already in motion, but she had learned to operate within a rhythm that did not depend on the city's approval. Inside the truck, everything was arranged with increasing efficiency, from the placement of ingredients to the sequence of preparation that now followed a predictable system she had refined through repetition. The smell of warm oil and fresh ingredients filled the small enclosed space as she moved between tasks without pause, her attention divided only by necessity rather than distraction. Outside, the first wave of customers began forming earlier than before, no longer arriving by coincidence but by expectation. People stood in line with a sense of familiarity, as if the food truck had become part of their daily structure rather than an occasional discovery. Some checked their phones, others talked quietly among themselves, but most simply waited, watching the small window where Alicia worked with steady concentration. She served each order without unnecessary words, maintaining a pace that balanced demand and control, adjusting portions, timing, and workflow with a precision that had slowly become instinctive. Over time, she noticed that the nature of the crowd had changed again. It was no longer limited to nearby workers or passers-by, but now included individuals who seemed to arrive from other parts of the city, drawn by something they had seen or heard beyond the immediate environment. A few mentioned social media clips, brief recordings that had circulated beyond her awareness, but she never engaged deeply with those comments, treating them as background noise rather than direction. Instead, she focused on the immediate reality of the truck, the heat of the stove, the timing of orders, and the steady flow of movement that defined each hour of operation. By midday, the line extended further than before, stretching along the sidewalk in a quiet but organized formation that required patience from both sides. Alicia adapted without complaint, adjusting preparation in real time, ensuring that quality remained consistent even as volume increased. There was no celebration in her response to growth, only adjustment, as if expansion itself was simply another variable to manage. During a brief moment of pause between orders, she looked out through the service window and observed the crowd not as individuals but as a pattern of behavior shaped by repetition and trust. That observation remained internal, without verbal expression, but it reinforced her understanding that consistency was becoming the foundation of recognition. Later in the afternoon, a customer who had clearly traveled farther than most asked a simple question about how long she had been operating, and the question lingered briefly in the air before she answered with minimal detail, returning immediately to her work. As the day progressed, the rhythm of activity intensified but did not break her structure. Even when the line grew longer and the pressure of timing increased, she maintained the same controlled pace that had defined her earlier days, proving that stability under demand was now part of her process. By evening, when the crowd finally began to thin, she remained inside the truck for a few moments longer than usual, reviewing the remaining ingredients and mentally noting the patterns of demand that had shaped the day. The financial results were once again higher than before, but she did not treat the numbers as an endpoint, only as confirmation of continuity. Outside, the city continued its indifferent movement, but within the small space she controlled, something had begun to settle into permanence, not as recognition from others, but as mastery of repetition sustained long enough to become undeniable. The morning arrived with a sharper clarity than the days before, as if the city had finally begun to recognize a pattern forming in a place it once ignored, and Alicia Bennett stood inside the food truck with the same controlled calm that now defined every movement she made. The street outside was already active, with steady streams of pedestrians, delivery vehicles, and workers moving in predictable cycles, but what had changed was not the city itself, rather the attention directed toward her small space within it. The line had begun forming earlier than usual, and it no longer resembled a casual gathering of curiosity, but something closer to expectation, as if people had already decided before arriving that they would be part of a shared experience. Alicia continued her work without interruption, her focus divided only between preparation and timing, never allowing external pressure to alter the internal rhythm she had built. Orders increased in frequency, and the space inside the truck became a controlled sequence of motion, where every second mattered in maintaining consistency. Outside, conversations among waiting customers began to shift in tone, no longer centered on discovery but on recognition, with mentions of repeated visits, social visibility, and growing awareness spreading through informal channels. Some customers referenced seeing the truck mentioned in short videos and local discussions, while others arrived specifically because someone had recommended it without hesitation. Alicia acknowledged none of this directly, maintaining a quiet professional distance that separated her work from interpretation, treating each order as an isolated task within a continuous system. As the day progressed, the flow of people became more structured, forming patterns that required her to adapt without breaking pace. She adjusted preparation sequences to maintain efficiency, ensuring that increased demand did not compromise quality, and over time this discipline created a stability that others began to rely on. In the middle of the afternoon, there was a moment when the line extended further than usual, reaching beyond the immediate sidewalk and into the adjacent block, yet even then the atmosphere remained orderly rather than chaotic. People waited with patience, as if aware that the experience inside the truck justified the time spent outside it. Alicia moved through each interaction with the same steady control, responding only when necessary, and returning immediately to preparation without lingering engagement. The repetition of this cycle created a visible structure that others began to mirror, adjusting their own behavior to match the rhythm she established. Later, During a brief pause when the line temporarily slowed, she stepped back slightly from the preparation area and observed the flow of activity through the service window, noticing how presence alone had replaced explanation as the primary driver of attention. There was no need for promotion or external validation within the moment itself, because the accumulation of consistent experience had already begun to define perception. Even without direct awareness of broader attention circulating beyond the immediate street, she could sense that the scale of engagement was no longer confined to local familiarity. Yet her response remained unchanged, rooted in continuation rather than interpretation. As evening approached and the light softened across the street, the final wave of customers for the day moved through in a steady rhythm, and Alicia maintained the same controlled precision until the last order was completed. When the service window finally closed, she remained inside for a moment, reviewing the day not as achievement but as continuity, noting patterns of demand, timing adjustments, and the growing consistency of return visits. The numbers had increased once again, but she treated them as confirmation of structure rather than transformation of identity. Outside, the city continued its movement without pause, but within the confined space she controlled, something had solidified further, not as recognition from others, but as proof that repetition, when sustained without deviation, eventually becomes its own form of undeniable presence. The morning arrived with a quieter tension than before, as if the city had begun to recognize something it could not yet fully define, and Alicia Bennett stood inside the food truck already preparing for a day that felt heavier not in difficulty but in awareness. The first light reflected off the metal surfaces outside, and the familiar rhythm of early movement returned as pedestrians, vehicles, and delivery routes resumed their patterns, yet there was a subtle difference in how people now approached the space around her. The line began forming earlier again, but this time it carried a more deliberate structure, with individuals arriving in groups rather than alone, some holding their phones slightly raised as if confirming location or reference before stepping forward. Alicia maintained her routine without interruption, moving through preparation with the same controlled precision that had defined every previous day, but she could sense that the nature of attention had shifted from curiosity to recognition that required no explanation. Orders were processed in a steady sequence, and the interior of the truck functioned as a contained system where every motion had been refined through repetition. Outside, conversations among customers were no longer only about taste or convenience, but increasingly about consistency, presence, and the growing visibility of the truck beyond its immediate surroundings. A few individuals mentioned that they had seen longer discussions forming online, small clusters of attention expanding beyond local awareness, though Alicia did not engage with those details directly. She responded only through action, maintaining the structure of service as the line continued to grow. As the afternoon progressed, the flow of customers became more continuous, requiring her to adjust timing with greater precision, yet she did so without hesitation, allowing the system she had built to absorb increased demand naturally. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, only adaptation, as if every change in volume had already been accounted for in principle even if not in detail. At one point, a brief pause in the line allowed her to look outward through the service window, where she observed not individuals but patterns of movement that now extended beyond immediate recognition. People were arriving with expectation already formed, and leaving with impressions that seemed to carry further than the space itself. The structure she had built through repetition was now producing its own momentum, independent of direct explanation. Later in the day, she noticed that the line no longer fluctuated as unpredictably as before, but instead followed a more stable curve, maintaining presence even during slower hours. This consistency created a different kind of pressure, not disruptive but sustained, requiring endurance rather than adjustment. Alicia continued working through it without change. In demeanor, treating each order as a continuation of the same process rather than a response to external demand. When the evening finally approached and the final wave of customers began to thin, she remained inside the truck for a longer moment than usual, reviewing the state of supplies, the flow of the day, and the subtle changes in behavior that had accumulated over time. The numbers once again reflected growth, but she did not interpret them as destination, only as confirmation that the structure she had built through repetition was continuing to hold under increased visibility. Outside, the city returned to its standard rhythm, but within her controlled space, something had begun to stabilize further, as if repetition itself had reached a point where it no longer needed reinforcement to continue expanding on its own. The morning arrived without announcement, only a gradual shift in light across the city skyline as Alicia Bennett stood inside the food truck for what felt like a familiar beginning, yet carried the weight of something that had already moved beyond beginning. The street outside was already active, but the pattern of movement had changed again, not in volume alone but in intent, as groups of people arrived earlier than before, forming lines that extended further down the block with a consistency that no longer appeared accidental. Alicia moved through her preparation routine with the same controlled precision she had maintained for weeks, adjusting ingredients, managing heat, and organizing workflow in a sequence that had become fully internalized. There was no pause in her motion, no hesitation, only continuity, as if every action had already been rehearsed through repetition rather than instruction. Outside, the crowd no longer behaved like individual customers but like a structured presence, with people returning multiple times, referencing prior visits, and speaking in tones that suggested shared recognition rather than isolated discovery. Somi mentioned that the food truck had begun circulating in broader discussions, appearing in multiple local digital spaces, though the information reached her only indirectly through passing remarks. She did not respond to it, not because she ignored it, but because it did not alter the immediate system she was maintaining. As the hours progressed, the line became steady rather than fluctuating, forming a continuous flow that required sustained operational discipline rather than reactive adjustment. Alicia maintained that discipline without deviation, ensuring that each order passed through the same standard of preparation regardless of external pressure. At moments when demand peaked, she expanded timing efficiency through subtle internal adjustments, redistributing tasks in a way that preserved consistency under load. The environment inside the truck became increasingly structured, as if repetition had refined it into a stable mechanism capable of handling growth without disruption. During a brief lull in the afternoon, she paused only long enough to observe the pattern outside, noticing that the waiting crowd had developed its own rhythm, one that mirrored her internal pacing without direct coordination. The awareness of this alignment remained unspoken, but it reinforced a quiet understanding that what she had built was no longer limited to individual effort but had become a system others were adapting to naturally. As evening approached, the flow of customers gradually slowed, though not in the same unpredictable manner as before. It followed a measured decline, as if the day itself had learned structure through repetition. Alicia continued working through the final orders with the same precision, completing each task without deviation, and ensuring that closure followed the same discipline as opening. When the last transaction was completed, she remained inside the truck for a longer moment than usual, reviewing the state of supplies, observing the patterns of demand recorded through experience rather than documentation, and acknowledging internally that the structure she had built was now operating with stability independent of initial conditions. Outside, the city returned to its continuous motion, indifferent and unchanged in appearance, yet within the confined space she controlled, the outcome of sustained repetition had become unmistakable. What began as survival had transitioned into consistency, and what began as consistency had now settled into something that no longer required validation to continue existing.